Okay. Yes, my name is Dan, and I'm very excited to talk to you today about power analysis, why, how, and when. Just to give you a bit of background about what I do, I'm a senior researcher at the University of Oslo, primarily working with the neuropeptide oxytocin and how it affects our thoughts and feelings. And a lot of the work that I do involves doing trials of clinical oxytocin, comparing oxytocin with placebo. So within that, it's very important to do power analyses to make sure that my results are going to be informative. So that is what we're going to do, and we're going to jump straight into it. So I will start with a basic definition of what statistical power is, and it is the probability of observing a statistically significant effect given a sample size, alpha level, and a hypothetical effect size of interest. So these four things are quite important, because these are the four things we need to do, or these are the three things we need to do to calculate your power. But the thing is, these things are all related. So if you know any three of them, you can calculate the fourth. So in terms of actually calculating power, if you know your sample size, your alpha level, and your hypothetical effect size of interest, which we're going to get into quite soon, then you can calculate power. But then if you want to actually estimate the sample size that you need, then you plug in the other three things so you can figure out the fourth thing. So the goal of statistical power is to limit the possibility of a false negative result for a hypothetical effect size of interest. So the general idea is, for instance, when you're submitting your paper for ethical review, your ethics board want to know with you the way that you're collecting the data or the way that your study is designed. Is there a likelihood of that you're actually going to have a false negative result? So this is why it's very important to do your power analysis, and it's typically performed to determine the required sample size for when you are doing your study.
Okay.
Now, in terms of actually figuring out the sample size for your study, there are a couple of ways that you can do this. There's a really great preprint that came out from Daniel Larkins, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, which outlines the ways that you can actually justify your sample size. Now, there can be no justification, and that's fine. Most papers don't give any justification at all. But if you're actually explicit by saying, hey, we don't have any justification, this is what we're doing, that's better than nothing. There's also this idea of resource constraints. Now, I understand that a lot of people watching are PhD students or master's students, and there are two main constraints: money and time. Time is particularly a nasty one, because you only have so much time to perform your work. So there's this idea that that is a massive constraint with how many participants that you can collect. So for a lot of people, when you actually ask them, okay, what sort of effect size are you anticipating? People don't know. But when you ask them, what are your resources like? How many people can you actually collect? People can say, oh yeah, I can collect 50 people. That is actually a much easier and straightforward way to understand your sample size. And that is not a great justification, but that is a fair justification. And quite often, when you're not actually sure what effect size you should be using in power calculation, at least looking at your resource constraints is one place that you can possibly start when it comes to doing your analysis. There's also rules of thumb, where you can simply look at past studies, and this is very common in the literature, in that past study 3 years ago, this was the effect size, or this is the sample size they used. We have a similar design. We are doing the same thing. Again, not an ideal way of doing it, but it is a way, and it is a justification. You can also measure the entire population of interest. Within Scandinavia, these public registries are incredible. So if your research question is, what is the effect of X on birth outcomes in Norway, you can literally answer that question, because you can look at every single birth outcome in Norway. And when you're looking at an entire population, you don't even have to do hypothesis testing, because there's no hypothetical population you're actually assessing. You're looking at the entire population. The other context is, for instance, if you're working with a very rare condition, say you're in the Netherlands and there is a rare condition and there's only 20 people in the country that has this condition, and you are testing all these people, that is the extent of your population. You cannot test more people. So that's another consideration. Also happens with athletes and elite athletes as well. But in rare medical conditions, sometimes there is a limit of the population. Then you also have accuracy is another perspective, where you can collect enough participants to achieve a particular error range as well. And of course, what we have been talking about is an a priori power analysis, where you can recruit enough participants in order to reliably detect an effect size of whatever or larger. Now, there are a few consequences of underpowered study designs. Now, it's very important to remember, quite often on Twitter, you'll see a lot of people going, look at this study. This study was underpowered. But it's really important to remember that a study can never be underpowered. What is underpowered is the design and the statistical test. That is what's underpowered, the design of the study and the test, not the actual study itself. So probably the biggest consequence of underpowered studies is you're not likely to detect a large range of effects. You want to be able to detect the largest range of effects that you can, or at least from the minimally interesting effect to and larger. But if you have an underpowered study, the amount of effects that you can reliably detect actually shrinks and gets quite small. In many cases, it's also a waste of resources. So if you're going to the trouble of collecting participants for a study, yet the likelihood of making an error or false negative is quite high, then this is it can be considered quite a waste. Now, there are a few caveats there. So for instance, if you don't have that many resources, but you still want to run a study, what you can do is you can run a small study in the hope that in the future, meta-analyses will actually combine these series of small studies. So if you have a very good understanding that other people are going to do future studies, it might even be yourself. Maybe you want to see how things change over time or in different populations, or if other people around the world are doing smaller studies, then you can legitimately say, hey, I'm going to run this study. I know it's underpowered, but I know in the future, people are going to do meta-analyses. So that's one small caveat there. You also get uninformative results in the sense that a non-significant result could be due to an insensitive study design. It's really, just before this talk, I was reviewing a paper, and in the paper, they basically concluded, look, that there's no difference between these interventions based on a non-significant p-value. But the thing is, with a non-significant p-value, this is either due to a null result or an insensitive study. It doesn't matter how big the p-value is, it's either one of those two things. So if your study is underpowered, then your results, your significant and your non-significant results are likely to be uninformative. Okay, so let's talk about false positives versus false negatives. You may see that the current standards for power analysis are 80%. So this means an error rate of 0.2 or 20%, and an alpha or a p-value of 0.05. These are the standards. In some places, the standards are up to 90% power or 95% power. It just depends. But for many people, at least within psychology, the standard is 80% and a p-value or an alpha of 0.05. And many researchers, I mean, this has been me over the past few years until I understood more about this, but many researchers don't consider what these values actually mean. So if we're going to be taking these typical values of 80% power and 0.05, this really means that you consider false positives to be 4 times more worse than false negatives. Maybe when you think about it for the context of your study, you think this is a good thing and this is reasonable. If so, this is great. This actually means that you've considered the standard ways of doing these kind of things, and you're happy with that. But maybe you're just as concerned with both types of errors. And if that would be the case, then perhaps you can consider increasing your power to 0.95 if you're concerned about that kind of error. Like I said, the convention for power is 0.8, but in some departments, they have to test for your study to be approved, it has to be 0.9 or even 0.95. I know some journals, for instance, Nature Human Behavior, if you're proposing a registered report study in which you propose the research design and reviewers review it before collecting data, when it comes to actually looking at power, they actually say you need a power of 0.90, or I think it's 0.9 or 0.95, one of those two. Anyway, because they're concerned about those types of errors. So you have to think about, are you happy with a false positive error rate of 20%? Think carefully about that. If you're trying to replicate a study, a false positive error rate of 20% is probably too low. So think about the context of your study. Okay, in terms of alpha levels, there's been a lot of discussion about alpha levels online. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion for about the past 50 years, but this is intensified over the past couple of years, particularly with two prominent articles arguing for reducing the default alpha level. Right now it's 0.05, and there have been calls of reducing it to 0.005, which in principle, all things equal, would reduce false positives. But at the same time, this would increase the need for resources. So you always have to balance these things up in that, yes, this thing would reduce false positives, but is this worth it in return for the need for increasing resources? Like I said before, in some cases, it's very difficult to recruit some clinical populations, for instance, or things are very expensive. So you have to weigh up these things and not think mindlessly that these are the thresholds I'm going to be using, but think about the resources and the sort of what you're happy with when it comes to the risk of false positives and the risk of false negatives. So you have to justify your thresholds by considering the cost and benefit of these certain alpha levels. Okay, so let's talk about how different levels of power can influence the ability to reliably detect a range of effects. So let's get into it and let's consider this study design. Let's consider a design where you're doing a paired samples t-test, which is fairly common within the biobehavioral sciences, with 20 participants. When I was doing my postgrad work as PhD in honors, we just had this magic number that 20 per cell is what you should be aiming for. And that's the heuristic that we were told. So that's why I'm going to be using 20 in this example here. So we have 20 participants and a hypothetical effect size of interest of 0.5, which in many circumstances, or if you're going by Cohen's thresholds, is considered a medium effect size. We're going to circle back to that. Okay, so we have an hypothetical effect size of interest of 0.5 and an alpha of 0.05. Okay, so let's look at that. Here we have the results here. For this particular design, for this test, which is a paired samples t-test and design, we have power of 0.56. And then we can actually see the likelihood of whether the power is actually going to miss a whole set of effects. So if we look down on the table here, we can actually see this sort of design would very, very likely detect an effect of 0.05, so quite a large effect, and probably detect an effect between 0.6 and 0.8 and 0.85. And we also have this power contour plot. So you can see how these things change depending on sample size and the hypothetical effect size. So you can actually see through this curve or this plot that if you increase your sample size, the hypothetical effect size that you can reliably detect actually gets smaller. However, if you want to say the hypothetical effect size you want to detect based on this design is higher, then you can get away with recruiting fewer participants. I think visualizing and thinking about power as a curve is a much better way of thinking about power analysis than thinking of it as a static number. When it comes to power analysis, you're always thinking about the true effect size. That you will never know the true effect size. With power analysis, you want to see what sort of effect sizes or what range of effect sizes can you reliably detect. So in this case, the power isn't great. It's 0.56. However, if we want to increase it, then we can either increase the hypothetical effect size that we're interested in. Maybe you don't care about effect sizes that are smaller than 0.1, or you can increase your sample sizes. So these things are related in that way. So this is another demonstration of how simply so right now, the power is 0.56. By increasing the sample size to about 37 participants, then our power would be 80. So we can reliably detect an effect size of reliably detect an effect size of 0.5. If you want even more reliability then you can increase your sample size. But here, by looking at this curve, you can see the relationship between the number of participants you have in your study and the power that you have. Okay, so let's look at what you can reliably detect with this study design. So we have 20 participants, 80% power. So we want to go with 80% power and an alpha of 0.05. Okay, so this particular design, so this is going the other way around. So this is thinking about, okay, so say if I want to achieve 80% power and I have 20 participants, what can I actually detect? And in this case, you can reliably detect an effect size of 0.66. So by the way, these plots and these analyses are all done in JAMOVI. There's a module in JAMOVI, which is free software called JPower. and you can do power analyses for 3 or 4, I think 3 different types of tests. So all these plots and all these results come from JAMOVI. And I'm going to run through at the end how to actually do this yourself. It's quite straightforward. So here we have, based on this design, what sort of effect sizes that you can detect. So 0.66, yeah, you can reliably detect that. But then smaller effect sizes, you can't. So you have to think about when you're designing your studies, here, if you think that an effect size of 0.4 is quite plausible, then looking at this power analysis or looking at this power curve, you can actually see that the chances of your study reliably detecting this effect aren't great. So the power curve is a really good way of thinking about these things. And again, here is a demonstration of how these how power is actually related to your hypothetical effect size of interest and your sample size as well. If you want more reliability, then you have to increase your sample size. So, like I said before, when you are designing your study, you have to think about what effect sizes that you would like to be able to reliably detect. And by running these power curves, you can actually see what those effect sizes are. Maybe you're happy with it, maybe if you're not. But by actually making a start and making these power curves, you can see what sort of effect sizes that you can reliably detect. Okay, so when it comes to power, the actual power that we want is pretty easy to figure out. It's maybe you're generally happy with 80% or 90%. The alpha, let's just say for argument's sake, you're happy with 0.05. But the trickiest thing, the hardest thing for power analysis in most cases is figuring out what your hypothetical effect size of interest is going to be. The conventional approach to doing this is looking at what has been shown before. People can say, oh, well, the last study did this, so this is what I'm going to be doing in terms of, or the last study reported an effect size of this, so I'm going to power my study using that. But I think the correct way, I know the correct way to select your effect size of interest is, what do you want to show? What do you want to show? Unless you're doing a direct replication, your study is going to be different than prior studies. So using that as an example isn't the best way to go. And at the same time, you cannot know the true effect, but you can design your study to reliably detect a range of effects. So it's better to think about this range of effects rather than a single static number. Okay, and there's a few ways that you can do this, which we're going to go through, which is past research, pilot research. So you may think, oh, I'm going to do a pilot study in order to actually look at the sort of effect sizes that are realistic. There's Cohen's benchmarks of small, medium, and large effect size, and there's also the smallest effect size of interest as well. Okay, so this, I think, is the next few slides are probably the most important slides of the whole talk. So if you're going to pay attention now. This is a plot which compares a number of studies within the same research area. The top side, the purple side, are the studies without pre-registration. And the bottom side are the studies with pre-registration, in which the authors pre-registered their hypotheses and their research designs. The effect sizes for the studies with pre-registration were much smaller than the studies without. This isn't a surprise, but this is a great visualization and demonstration of how these studies with pre-registration effect sizes are smaller, and how without pre-registration, the effect sizes are much, much larger. So what's the context of this? Or what are the consequences of this? So say you were using past research as a way to power your study. And what you would do is you would plan for 60 participants, because you would look at past research, or you would look at the average of past research, and you would see an effect size of 0.37. And of course, you can go, well, this is what the research says. But research which is not pre-registered tends to have inflated effect sizes. So we know that the real effect, well, the closest thing to the real effect is more likely to be 0.16. This is the average of studies that were pre-registered. So this is more likely to reflect the true effect size. You would miss this. You would miss this effect if you were powering your study using the published studies. So we can see on this plot here that the real effect would completely be missed. And this is one reason why studies are not replicating, and why psychology is in the midst of a replication crisis, because quite often people are powering their studies based on inflated effect sizes. So using past research as a way to power your study isn't the best way to go. A lot of people use pilot studies in order to look at the power for their main study. But the problem with power studies is, well, two things. Smaller studies or smaller pilots provide more variable effect sizes. So if you were to run 100 of these small studies, the variability of these effect sizes are quite large. Whereas if you were to run a number of large effect sizes, the variability of these effect sizes would be quite small. And there's a chance when you run the small study that you actually get quite a large effect size by chance. And there's follow-up bias. So you do a pilot study thinking, oh, is this thing going to work? By chance, you get a large effect size and you think, great, we're going to run a full study on this based on the large effect size that we got. But that was a large effect size that you got by chance, which is what you get when you run a smaller study, or the likelihood of that is more likely to happen with a smaller study. So in this example, in this plot, we can see, assuming that the true effect size is medium, and with pilot studies of 10 or 25, this would lead to underpowered study designs. If you're doing a pilot study of 50, you're actually getting pretty close. And in many research fields, 50 is actually the number you do in a normal study. But this kind of this demonstrates why you shouldn't be using pilot studies for powering your studies. Now, pilot studies are great. They're great for looking at the feasibility of your experiment, but they shouldn't be used for powering or for determining the sample size for your main experiment. So there's a great paper there, which is a reference at the bottom if you want to look more into that. Okay, now good old Cohen's rules of thumb. He's described these rules of thumb in the late 80s for 0.2, 0.5, and 0.8. This is looking for differences between groups, but there are also rules of thumb for different types of statistical tests in terms of small, medium, and large effects. Now, it's really important to remember the historical context. When Cohen first proposed these benchmarks, Cohen said this has to be an absolute backup. When you have no idea about the size of effects in your field, use this only when you have no idea. Yet people have used this as gospel, that this is what a medium effect is, or a small effect, or a large effect. So you can obviously see the error in that. And when he originally proposed a medium effect, he was like, well, a medium effect is something that you can kind of see with your eye. And it happens to actually be the medium effect in many fields. So in that respect, he was quite right, at least within psychology. And the idea that the small effect and a large effect is equidistant from this medium effect. So maybe 0.5 is average in your field, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a bit smaller, maybe it's a bit larger. So a medium effect, all this means is that it's just the average effect for a body of research. I think it's handy actually visualizing and explaining what these small, medium, and large effects are. Quite often when I actually show people, they might go, well, I'm powering my study for a small effect. I'm like, okay, but do you know what a small effect actually looks like? And when you visualize it in this way, by actually looking at the difference in these distributions, you can actually see it's actually not that much. So for instance, when you're looking at this and you're looking at a small effect size, 57.9% of the treatment group is above the mean of the control group. That's not very much. And 92% of the groups overlap for a small effect size. So the effect of a small effect size is really, really small. Let's go to medium. Medium isn't much better. 80% of these groups overlap. So a medium effect size, which is what most people tend to start off with when it comes to doing power analysis, isn't that big. Maybe you're satisfied with these differences. Maybe you're working with a clinical condition where a modest difference will make a huge difference for someone's quality of life. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with small effects, but you have to think about the context of your research and what matters to you. And a large one, things are a bit better. Almost 70% of the groups overlap. So there's quite a difference there. If you're interested in this tool and you're thinking about your effect size of interest and what it looks like and the consequences, go to rpsychologist.com. Amazing visualizations. Check it out. Okay. And the other approach that you can do is, well, the other thing to think about is that Cohen's rules for what's small, medium, and large doesn't reflect every research field, like I mentioned. So for me, I was actually curious as to how this would work for one of my research fields, my other research field, which is cardiac physiology, where we collect heart rate variability as a measure of parasympathetic nervous system activity. And quite often you'll compare this between two groups. So I was very interested to actually see what is the effect size distribution within my field. There's been almost 300 studies done on this, so we can get a nice distribution there. And I was interested to see how close is the distribution to Cohen's norms. And I found that the medium norm was actually quite close. So for this particular field, if you were using Cohen's norms, you're actually pretty close to what really represents a medium effect. Yet the small and large were a little bit larger than what Cohen would suggest. So this is one approach, but of course, if there's a lot of publication bias in a particular field, then these effects are likely to be inflated. At least within this field, there isn't that much publication bias. So this isn't much of an issue, but for some fields, there's a huge amount of publication bias. So not even this approach would work well. So this is one way of doing it, at least to give you an initial guide for where to get started, but it still isn't the best because it's basically saying we're going to use what other people have done to dictate what I'm going to do for my own research, when you can actually say what am I interested in the most for doing my own research. So this conventional approach is really based on what other people are doing when you think about what you want to do yourself. Okay, so to summarize, we have for thinking of ways to demonstrate your small effect size of interest, of course, there's Cohen's rules of thumb, which I've suggested to try to avoid. But there's the so-called small telescopes approach, which I know it's a rule of thumb, but it's actually a pretty good one, and will at least give you a good starting point. And in this approach, you select a prior study or a body of studies, and you power your study with an effect size. The prior study would have 33% power to detect. So if you had a prior study with 50 participants, a paired t-test would have 33% power to detect an effect size of 0.22. So this is a good starting point if you want to use a rule of thumb. Now, here is a practical example of how to select your smallest effect size of interest. There was a study that was done a couple of years ago, and it was asking the question, can the human visual system detect changes in facial redness over the menstrual cycle? And the thing when it comes to the smallest effect size of interest is that human vision actually has a specific threshold of color sensitivity. There's a certain point where maybe a computer can tell the difference, but the human eye cannot tell the difference between different colors. So here we actually have a natural threshold. So anything below a certain difference is not of interest because humans can't even detect it. So in this context, you would actually set your minimally interesting effect size to this threshold. Maybe within your research field, this is actually possible in that there is some sort of minimal threshold that you can actually select as your smallest effect size of interest. So let's say for argument's sake, in this case, the threshold will be 0.04. And then within JAMOVI, then you can do your analysis where you can simply say, hey, my minimally interesting effect is 0.4. My minimum desired power is 0.8, 80%. You'll notice the N part is grayed out because that's what we're trying to calculate. And then you can also look at the relative size of 0.2 to 0.1. Maybe your design is unbalanced and you know you can recruit more people in group 1 than group 2. And then you have your error rate and also your tails, which we're going to come back to soon. So in this case, we need 100 people in each group to actually detect this minimal effect size of interest. So we can see that as we decrease the sample size, an effect size of 0.4 becomes less reliably detected. But hey, maybe you're happy to detect only larger effect sizes. Again, I wish I could say this is what you should do for your research. But the thing is, there's no rules of thumb. You have to think carefully about your own research and justify why you're picking these effect sizes of interest. So like I said before, sometimes it can be hard thinking about what your effect size of interest is or what your smallest effect size of interest is. But when you ask people how many people they can actually test, their answer is pretty quick. So if you're still struggling for a starting point of how to do your power analysis, think about power curves, plug in how many people that you can actually test. And then you can say, well, okay, let's say you only have enough resources to collect 80 participants, 40 per group, and you can only reliably detect an effect size of 0.63. Think about, is this satisfying? Is this sort of effect satisfying? If it's not, then you have to think of ways to actually increase your power, which I'm going to explain soon. But at least you can use it as a starting point. So when it comes to JPower, there are 3 designs and there are more coming. It's a really, really great tool and probably the best visualization out there for running these power curves and giving a good start when it comes to doing your power analysis. If you want a little bit more flexibility, then there is a fantastic package called the Power Package, where you can run power analyses for a number of different tests, which I've put up there. Of course, this isn't a lot of stuff, but it's much more than from JPower. So to give you an example of how things would run, it's very, very similar to how things are in JPower. So in this particular example, where I'm interested in looking at the power for a correlation. So within this package, essentially, you have your 4 things, like I mentioned before. You have your number, your effect size, in this case, it's Pearson's R, the significance level that you're interested in, and the power that you're after. Like I said, you can calculate the 4th if you know any of the other 3 things. So in this example, I've put in, I'm interested in an effect size of 0.2, which is considered a small effect size, a significance level of 0.5, and power of 0.8. So you plug all these things in, and you can also choose the option of doing a 2-sided test or a 1-sided test, and it'll give you the answer. So here it is 193 or 194 participants. So you can do that. It's very, very straightforward. Even if you aren't that confident in R, it's not a tricky R package, and the documentation is quite good. And there's a lot of tutorials online on how to do this. So if you want to look at how to actually run your power analysis for different tests, I will check that out. Okay, ANOVA design, which is also quite common in the biobehavioral sciences. There's a great tool, a great online tool, which is available both as an online calculator, but also an R package, where you can do ANOVA design for ANOVA analyses, including interactions as well. So there's you have to add in a little bit more information than the other power analyses because there's more parameters there. But I will check this out if ANOVA design is one thing that you're interested in. And then if you're doing more complex designs, then you would need to start simulating data for power analysis for these more complex designs. And there are a few packages available in order for you to do that, and a few calculators online as well. So you just have to think about, because remember, when it comes to doing a study doesn't have power, it is the study design and the statistical test. So look at the statistical test that you're doing, and then you have to actually calculate power for that test. Now, here are some ways maybe you've looked at that going, gee, I do not have the resources to collect, to detect a wide range of effect sizes. The only effect size I can collect is 0.6, and I'm convinced the effect sizes of 0.4 are much, much more plausible. There are ways that you can actually improve this. And we're going to hop into the first one here, which is having a directional hypothesis. Now, for many of us, you may think, yeah, I've got an hypothesis. And for many, you actually have a directional hypothesis where you think treatment A is going to improve scores, for instance. If you have a directional hypothesis, and if it has been pre-specified, then you can run your power analysis as a one-tailed power analysis. And by doing that, you only need to collect about less than 20% of participants, give or take, anywhere between 15 to 25%, but it roughly corresponds to about 20% fewer participants if you have a one-tailed test. Now, remember, this has to be pre-specified before you actually collect data. You can't just look at your study and go, I'm going to do a one-tailed test. You have to pre-specify this. So if your hypothesis is directional, you may think this thing is going to increase, or there's going to be a relationship or a positive or a negative relationship. Then you can specify these things. And if you're doing that, then you can run your power analysis as one-tailed. So let's have a look. And it also saves a lot of money. So, okay, let's think about this paired sample t-test. We have a hypothetical effect size of 0.2, yeah, power of 80%, and an alpha of 0.05. And let's also assume it costs 10 euros per participant to test. A two-tailed test would require 199 participants, so that's almost 2,000 euros. But if you're doing a one-tailed test, this drops down to 156. So it's a lot cheaper. It's a huge saving for essentially doing nothing. So if you're thinking about your hypotheses and you're like, yep, firstly, I have an hypothesis, and second, I have a good idea of the direction it's going to go, then you are saving yourself a ton of 20% of resources if you use your power analysis with a one-tailed test. Almost seems too good to be true. I submitted a grant application last year or a couple of years ago, and I said, hey, to save resources, I'm doing a one-tailed test because my hypothesis is I'm going to find a difference. It's going to be in this direction. And the reviewer was like, hey, I think you should do. You can't do that, but you can. You absolutely can. If you have an hypothesis in a certain direction, you can do a one-tailed power test. Now, the other thing is sometimes you're chatting with people and they still can't land on what an interesting hypothetical effect size is going to be. And if that's the case, you just have to consider in some cases, you shouldn't actually be doing a hypothesis test. Sometimes you merely want to be doing estimation. These are two different things. A hypothesis test isn't better science than doing estimation. It's just a different way of doing science. A lot of people have kind of said, well, the gold standard of science is doing hypothesis testing. But it's just a different way of doing science. But if you're looking at your research question and you realize that you can't come up with a hypothetical effect size of interest, or you can't think about what the minimal effect size of interest is, then maybe you shouldn't actually be doing that. So check out this paper as a perspective on maybe you should just be doing estimation. One other thing to think about is maybe you're very clear on what your smallest effect size of interest is, but maybe it's tiny, maybe it's 0.01. So if we look at this and if we think our hypothetical, our smallest effect size of interest is 0.05, this would require more than 3,000 participants. Before I showed you these 6 different justifications, there are more, by the way, but these are 6 sort of popular justifications for sample size for your study. These things aren't exclusive. You can combine these things for determining your sample size. So maybe you have to combine your smallest effect size of interest justification with a resources justification. You might look at this going, gee, I cannot collect 3,000 participants, but then you might adjust it to 0.1 to 787 participants, and that might be more realistic. It's fine to do that. Just be upfront in your paper as to why you did that. Be upfront and go, hey, like the resources only allowed this sort of thing, and this is the effect size that we can reliably detect with effect. We can reliably detect an effect size of 0.01. Okay, so I want to leave some space for questions, but I want to finish off with some take-home points. Is that the one thing I want you to remember when it comes to power analysis is you want to think about the range of effects that you can reliably detect. Don't think of it as a single number. Think about these power curves and think about what range of effects can I reliably detect with my power analysis. If you're not sure what to do, ask for help. There are people probably in your department that are really good at this and online. And I'd really encourage you, if you're not on Twitter, get amongst it. People are very, very helpful when it comes to stats on Twitter as well. The RStats hashtag is fantastic. You put a question out there and you're very likely to get an answer. So make sure you ask these questions if you're unsure. What might take you, it's great to learn yourself, but what might take you a week to discover could be solved in a couple of minutes if you're asking the right people. So don't be afraid. This stuff's hard, so don't be afraid to ask for help. Remember to justify your choices. Like I said before, if you're doing a combination of resource constraints and smallest effect size of interest, just be upfront and say, this is why this sample size was chosen. I would also stress the best thing you can do, one of the best things you can do for your career is learning R or Python. I know there are sort of differences between fields, but particularly within the biobehavioral sciences, when you learn R, you get so much more flexibility for doing these kind of things, especially if you have more complex designs where you have to do data simulation. One of the best things that you can do for your career is to learn R, and there's a lot of resources online. And if you feel frustrated, that's fine. That's normal. That means you're learning something. So I'd really encourage you to do that. So of course, there's going to be some time for questions down for discussion. If you want to find me online, there's a few different places there. And if you're into podcasts, I also co-host a podcast called Everything Hurts, where we talk a lot about research methods, but general life in the biobehavioral sciences. So check that out. And also, maybe you think of a question later, you can send me an email as well, and I can do my best to help you out. So yes, thanks for your attention, and let's open up the floor for some questions.